Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Breaking news here on Bloomberg TV and radio as Israel has confirmed that it has eliminated the head of Hamas, the architect, they say, of the October 7th attack on Israel from last year. Yahya Sinwar has been killed by the Israeli Defense Forces along with two others. We're awaiting a press conference, a news conference from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where we could expect, Joe, to hear more details, not just on how exactly the Israeli military was able to do this, but what is going to happen next now that another leader of an Iranian proxy has been killed by Israel.
It is pretty remarkable, Kailey, considering the number of operations, precision strikes that we've seen conducted by the IDF in Gaza over the last year plus. Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security coverage here in Washington, was implying a bit earlier that this may not have, in fact, been a direct attack intended to find Yahya Sinwar, that they were targeting other Hamas leaders, and only discovered after the fact that they had, in fact, reached the top of the chain here, with big questions on what we're going to hear ahead from Benjamin Netanyahu. We bring you live to Israel right now. Bloomberg reporter Dan Williams is in Jerusalem with the very latest. And Dan, it's great to have you back with us here on Balance of Power. What will we hear from the Prime Minister later this hour?
I imagine he will formally announce the death of Yahya Sinwar. He may make some sort of overture to what remains of Hamas leadership in Gaza, given that they still hold 101 hostages that Israel is hoping to recover. And obviously there will be some concern now that Hamas has been decapitated and the man who literally had the last say on the fate of those hostages is dead, that they may be lost, they may be at greater risk, or indeed this may be an opportunity for some kind of breakthrough in a negotiated hostage release. He may also give some operational details. You noted that the picture is a bit unclear. What we're hearing so far is that this killing, this decapitation of Hamas was really a function of happenstance. Apparently, a group of trainee tank commanders who were seconded from their training base to the Gaza offensive spotted a number of gunmen in a building in the south of Gaza yesterday, opened fire. And this morning, when they returned on foot to scour the ruins and see who was there, they found what appeared to them to be Sinwar from a basic physical match. Apparently, another of the bodies belonged to a battalion commander from Hamas who was known to have effectively been Sinwar's military secretary. So they added those findings together. There are photographs of his teeth that were matched to dental records, apparently fingerprints, DNA tests, and in recent minutes, the word has come through officially that indeed it is Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, the overall leader of Hamas, is dead.
Well, so what happens next within the ranks of Hamas, Dan? As the Israeli Foreign Ministry in its statement pointed out that his death creates a possibility for what they say is an immediate release of the abductees that were taken on October 7th. Who would it be negotiating that on behalf of Hamas now?
That's an excellent question. It's unclear. Netanyahu may shed some light on that question. I think what's clear is Israel, which set out at the beginning of this war, a war that's now more than a year old, its core aim of destroying, demolishing Hamas, eradicating it as a military threat, as the governing force, that still holds. So I don't think Israel is looking for a successful succession within Hamas Gaza or even Hamas abroad. I think what they're looking for is members of Hamas that are willing to step away from the organization, maybe cut a deal for their own survival, perhaps some kind of reward, and deliver those hostages, as many of them alive as possible. So there will be a big question about succession. Hamas has not formally confirmed yet Sinwar's death. That could just be a function of logistics, because Israel's had possession of his body since he was killed. Hamas may simply not have a way of corroborating his death themselves. They may also be conferring as much as possible about succession. I think it's worth noting that if they choose someone from within Gaza, and Sinwar was very much a Gaza figure, then that will allow them to keep portraying themselves as resisting the Hamas offensive, surviving despite this really crushing offensive in Gaza, at least for the time being. But that successor will be living on borrowed time and on the run without much of a public profile at all. If they choose a leader, a replacement from outside Gaza, say one based in Qatar or Turkey, for example, or Lebanon, then that man may have survivability, but it would really seem to be now an organization in exile rather than an organization that actually had its own mini-state in Gaza for something like 17, 18 years.
Wow, that's an important characterization, Dan. In that case, should we anticipate any response from Hamas? And what would be the reaction in Gaza and on the streets of Tehran to this headline?
I think there'll be shock, but I think that given you alluded to Tehran, Hamas, this began as a Gaza war, but it really is a region-wide war between Israel and an Iranian axis, including even Iran itself. Keep in mind that over 2 weeks ago, Iran fired some 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. We're still waiting for Israel's retaliation and for Iran's retaliation for the retaliation, which would really open up a new front, a long-distance front in this multi-front war. So the Iranian reaction will be of great interest, but I imagine they're still taking aboard the fact that Israel just a few weeks ago decapitated Hezbollah with a killing in Beirut of the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah. So really, this has been a cascade of decapitations. I think it would be fair to say that militarily, in terms of leadership, organizationally, the Iranian access, these various proxies on Israel's border are really on the ropes, and they may be weighing their actions and even their words very, very carefully. Hamas and Gaza will want to react, but I don't think they have the ability militarily. Just a few days ago, the region, Israel, the world marked the first anniversary of the October 7th Hamas attack, which began this war. Back on October 7th, 2023, they fired between 3,000 and 4,000 rockets to really sandbag Israel as they sent over fighters to carry out a mass killing and abduction campaign. On the anniversary, they wanted to show that they were still there, but they fired something like 14 rockets. So 14 compared to 4,000 rockets a year prior gives you a pretty good idea of where Hamas stands militarily nowadays. And Hezbollah is keeping up its fire from Lebanon, but that has also been reduced by Israeli precision strikes. So I'm not sure militarily they're in a position to escalate. I think they'll be weighing strategy very carefully. And indeed, there may be elements of Hamas in Gaza that decide it's time to cut a deal. It's time to survive, maybe accept exile and life in exile rather than death in Gaza. And if the cost is releasing, returning some or all of those hostages, that may be an appealing prospect for some of them.
Well, Dan, as you suggest, Hamas is very much depleted militarily, now just having its most senior leader killed. How much closer does this bring Israel to its stated objective of the elimination of Hamas in Gaza?
It brings it much closer, although we have been observing, and indeed the Biden administration has been very troubled by what appears to be a renewed and effectively punishing Israeli offensive in North Gaza, 3 districts outside Gaza City, that have really exacerbated the humanitarian situation there. Israel says it was forced to move in again, and I think it is maybe the 3rd or the 4th time on the ground because it had to crush an attempt by Hamas to regroup. Indeed, they said earlier this morning that they managed with an airstrike to kill a large number of Islamic Jihad and Hamas militants who were meeting in a former school in that area. The Palestinian authorities say that the dead there were civilians. So according to Israel itself, and certainly according to Hamas is not out for the count. It's still trying to regroup. But I think everyone would agree it's really an insurgency. And I don't doubt at all that this death, once it's taken aboard by Hamas and by the rest of the Iranian axis in the region, will have a demoralizing effect. I think they will be looking for successors, if not on a grand political level, at least people who can continue commanding what remains of Hamas forces on the ground. It'll be none of the same scale, and it may even, in spirit, embolden those Palestinians in Gaza who are opposed to Hamas and potentially are willing to take up the mantle in a post-Hamas, post-war Gaza.
All right, Bloomberg's Dan Williams reporting live for us from Israel on this news that the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, has been killed by the Israeli military. Thank you so much. And I would reiterate, we are awaiting a news conference from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that is set to begin this hour. We will bring you news from that, as well as from a U.S. State Department briefing that is set to begin in just a few minutes. But of course, we need to consider that this is happening against the backdrop of a presidential election just weeks away here in the U.S. So we do want to examine the political implications of events abroad here at home and turn now to Larry Sabato, director at the UVA Center for Politics. Larry, we do want to talk to you about the state of the presidential race overall, but we could look specifically at one state like Michigan, where there was a big protest vote against Biden during the primary cycle over protest of Israel's conduct in the war in Gaza and this administration's conduct as a result. How is a development like this one likely to impact some of those key demographics in a state like Michigan, Muslim and Arab American voters?
If this leads to peace or some kind of ceasefire, or it looks like we're even moving in that direction, it would probably help Harris. Of course, you also have to consider that Prime Minister Netanyahu does not really want to help Harris. Quite the opposite. While he's had his tussles with Donald Trump, he seems to favor Donald Trump. That certainly has been suggested by the reporting in the Middle East itself. So I'm not sure he wants to do anything to help Harris. Maybe events will take over and they will help her anyway. But it's not been an easy fall for the Democrats, that's for sure.
Well, that's for sure, indeed. And I wonder to what extent the Democratic nominee should seize this opportunity, if it is one, Larry, when it comes to messaging. We're going to hear from Benjamin Netanyahu first, it looks like. But when it comes to a statement out of the White House or the vice president's office, or even hearing from Kamala Harris on the campaign trail, how does she position herself with this development in Israel?
She needs to break with Joe Biden. It's just that simple. Yes, she was Joe Biden's vice president. I think, well, I'll tell you in a second, everybody knows vice presidents don't make the decisions. They may be in the room, they may toss in a thought or two, but it's the president who decides the direction. At this point, I think she would be very wise to say that while we continue to support Israel, and we would in a Harris administration, she believes that the policy needs to be more balanced, and that the attacks on civilians in the Middle East and Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere have to at least not have the full support of the United States. I don't know that there's anything in particular that would pressure Prime Minister Netanyahu. She needs to break with him, just like Hubert Humphrey broke with Lyndon Johnson in October of 1968 about the Vietnam War. It brought him from way back to finishing just a smidgen below Richard Nixon on Election Day.
Well, as we consider a break with President Biden, Larry, we did see Kamala Harris in an interview on Fox last night saying her presidency would not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency. But I would reiterate there, that was an interview on Fox, perhaps trying to woo some Republicans who are reluctant to vote for Donald Trump. At this stage in the race, with just weeks to go, how successful can either candidate be at changing minds at this point?
And not very, because the minds that are not mostly made up, to be blunt about it, are not people that are cross-pressured and evenly divided between the two candidates for the most part, not every case, but for the most part, they're people who don't follow politics very closely. How could anyone not have an opinion, at least about Donald Trump, after 9 years in which he was in our living rooms every single day doing controversial things? I mean, really. So a lot of them won't vote. And that's the amusing part of this. People keep focusing, and the press keeps focusing on the wrong element. It isn't the, quote, undecided, because there aren't many. It's about motivation and enthusiasm. How many of both sides turn up? That's what we need to look at.
Kamala Harris made it clear in her conversation on Fox News that, in fact, she would not be a continuation of the Biden White House. That has been the takeaway here, as we've been discussing on Balance of Power from this conversation that has happened at last. I just wonder, Larry, to what extent these attempts to speak to certain narrow demographics, whether it's black men for Kamala Harris or suburban women for Donald Trump, matter when we're this close to the election and the slice of undecided voters is so thin?
It probably doesn't matter very much. I mean, you have to have something to cover every day, right? You got a lot of hours to fill. Newspapers have a lot of space to fill, no longer on paper, but at least online. So you focus on the little controversies and the little issues and the little ideas that come forth from polling, suggesting this group is available or that group is available. But the truth is not much is going to change unless there's a big October surprise. Now, the Middle East counts. That would be a big October surprise. October surprises have affected the results of presidential elections in the last 50 years, several times. And we've had more October surprises that haven't affected the results. But you look for those things. And it's at the end when people really pay attention, even the people who haven't paid the slightest attention up to now.
Larry, we just have a minute left, but barring an October surprise, if you had to call this thing right now, who do you think wins?
Oh, I wouldn't call it. I'm not going to help you out there. I'm sorry. You're going to have to fill that minute with something else. I'm not about to do that.
Is it unique to this cycle, how difficult it is? Is it unique to this cycle? Would you have felt more comfortable in 2020 or 2016?
Well, the obvious answer is yes, particularly, we got it right in 2020 and wrong in 2016. So I would have felt very comfortable in 2020. But the truth is, having just told you, there could be an October surprise that could rearrange the 1 or 2%. That's all you have to switch, 1 or 2% to one side or the other. I'm going to wait for the surprises. And if they don't come, I'll just buy myself an extra birthday gift. I don't know.
She had to try. She had to, Larry. Absolutely. I love that. Larry Sabato, great to see you from, of course, the University of Virginia Center for Politics. I'm Joe Mathieu. She is Kailey Leinz. We have a lot more ahead.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
This is live coverage on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington here on Balance of Power. We've been showing you images, for those of you with us on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, of Benjamin Netanyahu delivering a message by video right now to the people of Israel. He's speaking in Hebrew and did say earlier he would like to salute all of the GSS, the IDF. There is no better than them, he said. It is now more clear than ever before that good will prevail over evil. The war has not ended yet, Benjamin Netanyahu says. It is hard, and we have paid heavy prices. This is a story that started developing, Kailey, just a couple of hours ago here, confirmed within the last hour. If you're just joining us, Israel now confirming the death of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, in an operation that took place earlier in Gaza. It's a pleasure to bring in the voice of Jane Harman now, of course, former Congresswoman, former chair of the Intelligence Committee, now chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission. She was former ranking member of House Intelligence and has been exposed to this story for many years. Jane, welcome back. It's good to see you. The significance of this development today.
You too. Huge, absolutely huge, and an opportunity to reset the table and move in a better direction. Let me say a couple things first. Number one, Sinwar will not be missed except by the radical Hamas fighters, and let us hope that the absence of him will create disarray among them. That's one. Number two, the IDF did a masterful job. It is important that this was a routine, so I understand, patrol of a tunnel, and they randomly ran into Sinwar, fortunately not surrounded by hostages. I had been afraid that the final act here would be Sinwar blowing himself up with the hostages around him. So there is the opportunity, if they are still alive, to get the hostages back. And what I'd like to suggest here is that the Sunni Arab countries weigh in and help suggest a path forward. There is one that has been put on the table by the Biden administration, which is a ceasefire, return of the hostages, and a plan, and not just that. A plan to move toward two states. And I think if the neighborhood embraces that, it's crucially important for two reasons. One, I think it's the best path to guarantee Israel's security. But number two, it will also hold Iran in check. And I'm still very worried about Iran funding proxies. And I worry that Hezbollah is still attacking Israel, as hard as that is to believe. And one more point. The U.S. Did some bombing against the Houthis, I think today. And that tells me that we cannot pivot out of the region. Our leadership is more needed than ever.
Yep, sent those B-2s the Houthis' way. Jane, just to reiterate for our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio, while the Prime Minister did speak in Hebrew, we've gotten some translation of his remarks, including what he said about the hostages still being held. He said, "I call on all those holding our captives. We will allow any of you who lays down his gun and returns our hostages to come out and live." He says, "By the same token, I say the blood of anyone who harms our hostages is forfeit. We will settle the score with him." Jane, as you just expressed there, still concern about these proxies, about Iran itself. Are you worried that Israel, through its moves, not just today, but in over the course of the last several weeks and months, may have made the situation for the hostages, the situation itself, just more dangerous rather than safer? Are we sure this is necessarily going to have a positive effect?
Well, first of all, it's the first time I'm hearing about what Netanyahu said about if you surrender and lay down your arms, we'll give you safe passage, or that's what I'm hearing. And that may be a path to get the hostages back. Let's understand there are still American hostages, too, in harm's way. And this has been a full year in dire conditions. So we desperately need that peace. And I applaud the Prime Minister for suggesting that. What about more radicalized populations? I think that's what you're asking me. Can this really be over? Yeah. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it cannot be over if all that happens is constant attacks, both in Gaza and in Lebanon. There is an opportunity here for the entire neighborhood. Remember, this was started by the Trump administration with the Abraham Accords, for the neighborhood to come together, work with Israel on two things. One is a positive relationship, and the second is a path to two states. If this happens, that's a huge buffer to Iran, which continues to empower all these proxy groups around the neighborhood, some of which are harming the U.S. Take the Houthis and U.S. ships, and we have bases throughout the neighborhood. We must stay. We must offer leadership. I don't think this should be a bipartisan moment in America. I think we should all salute this victory by the IDF and also embrace the notion that this is really an opportunity for a security deal that will help everyone and prevent Iran from causing more damage in the region.
You mentioned the neighborhood, Jane. With all of that said, we've learned that President Biden has been briefed on these developments on Air Force One on his way to Germany. To what extent will Sinwar's death color his talks with our European allies?
Well, I think, I'm guessing, I don't know, he hasn't landed yet, that he will applaud the IDF. It was the Biden idea, building on the Trump idea for Saudi Arabia to take the lead in building an arrangement with Israel. Most people think that Hamas attacked when it did because Israel was in some internal disarray, but also because they wanted to blow up that deal. So I think he should be positive about this. I also think it's great that he's going to Europe and hopefully with NATO to help Zelensky at a time of dire need win this war against Russian aggression. Now is the time, before the snow comes, for Israel to provide the aid, for NATO to provide the aid it has promised, and kudos to NATO, and for the U.S. to continue stepping up. And if we can do that, I do see an opportunity for some sort, as everyone's calling for this, some sort of negotiated end to this war, negotiated by Zelensky, not by us, and for a path to NATO membership. It's crucial that once this war ends, that there be a clear path to NATO membership for Ukraine, which is the best buffer for Europe and us against Russian aggression spreading further.
Well, Jane, I guess it becomes a question of timing. As we consider President Biden here in his final months in office, is it likely we are going to see a resolution to either of these conflicts, or at least material steps toward that resolution while he's still president of the United States?
I hope so. And I don't only say that because I would like Biden's legacy to be solid, and I would like it to be solid, but also because United States leadership is so crucial in both contexts. And I would like him, when he leaves, and I would say this about any president, to set the table for the next president, whoever that is, to show that U.S. leadership in a very different world, not the liberal world order that I've grown up under, but a new revived world order where partners and allies play a crucial role and the global South is included. That world order, I think, needs a fair resolution of the Ukraine matter and a pushback against unprovoked Russian aggression and a security deal for Israel where there are two states in the region with mutual agreements so that both sides live in peace, and Israel and the Sunni neighborhood together push against Iranian aggression. And just maybe, let's be a little hopeful here, Iran understands that it has to change its course and live peaceful in the region. The alternative is horrible, just simply horrible, and more death and destruction serves no good cause.
Jane, the press pool traveling today with Vice President Harris, who's holding campaign events in Wisconsin, is letting us know that she's going to be making a statement on this. She will speak from Milwaukee on the situation today in Israel. Does she need to say something different than Joe Biden?
Well, I hope that she will commend IDF and Israel for an important victory. The Biden policy, which I've just talked about, is one that I fully embrace, and I think she does, which is this Saudi deal where the region buys into a security path for everyone. But I do think she has to applaud what has just happened, and I hope former President Trump does too. I don't think partisanship is necessary here. I think U.S. leadership is necessary here.
Well, as we're discussing the presidential election and these two conflicts happening in the background with two adversaries, there's the question of Iran's physical threat that it poses to Israel or to U.S. Interests in the Middle East, the question of Russia and the threat it poses to Ukraine. Obviously, there's also the question of the influence these two powers could have on the election. How concerned are you about that? Just weeks to go until Election Day, Jane, attempts to disrupt the American democratic process.
Well, I'm very concerned about it. First of all, there are attempts inside America to disrupt the process, which concern me. But there is malign influence, no question. Our intelligence community has publicly stated this by Russia, China, Iran in our current election. I'm not sure about North Korea, but that, four-way alliance of grievance or whatever you want to call it is very disturbing. And this Commission on National Defense Strategy that I just chaired cites that as a reason why the world is as or more dangerous than it has been since World War II and why U.S. leadership is so necessary. So I'm very concerned, and I think more will happen. What I would like to happen, and there are bipartisan groups out there, I belong to a couple of them, trying to make this case to voters. I'd like voters to understand whether the information they're hearing, the material they're reading, is accurate or not, because obviously we would like this to be a fair and free election, and we would like as many people as possible to participate, however they choose to vote.
You mentioned the airstrikes in the last 24 hours that the U.S. conducted in Yemen, Jane. Awfully important when you consider the potential for another back and forth between Israel and Iran. We dropped some heavy ordnance to destroy underground facilities there to send a message, presumably a projection of power to let Iran know what we're capable of here. Will that help to put guardrails around whatever Iran does next?
Well, I hope so. Let's understand that these proxy groups of Iran are hugely capable. No one thought Hamas, it was a failure of imagination that Hamas could do what it did on October 7th of last year. No one thought that Hezbollah was as capable as it has turned out to be, that these missiles and rockets hidden in basements at the border would be as destructive as they have been over a very long period. And no one thought the Houthis would be this capable. Iran is claiming it's not giving direction to these groups, but it helped to arm them, and it helped to feed their radical ideology, calling for the destruction of Israel. No one should miss that. The threats to Israel are real. Israel's right to defend itself is real. But what I'm saying is tactics are one thing, A longer-term strategy is what's needed now, and I think the U.S. cannot pivot out of the region. Our leadership is crucial, and working with the Sunni neighborhood, I think we can really get somewhere now.
We'll leave it on that note. Jane Harman, chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission and former Congresswoman.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I want to add the voice of Adam Hodge, who was watching along with all of us. And, of course, he brings his own experience at Pulpit International. And I want to get into what is coming out of Israel today in a moment, Adam, as you, of course, spent time on the White House National Security Council. But as far as the media rounds go, I don't know how many more of these we're going to get. Donald Trump on Bloomberg this week, on Univision, Kamala Harris at last on Fox. Is this the last media gasp of this campaign?
We're getting there, Joe, no question. I think we are at the point, and you've heard from the Harris campaign, like they're clearly trying to build a broader coalition, right? They're going around the country, event yesterday on Fox News, and also an event with former Trump administration officials. But that was preceded by events in Detroit focused on Black men and turning out Black voters. So my conversations with the campaign, they're clearly trying to build a broader coalition because they think that's their ticket to victory.
I know both campaigns are going after what they see as their pockets of weakness. You just mentioned young Black men for Kamala Harris, even though she was on Fox News last night. That's been a big thrust behind her media appearances. Most recently, we saw her sit down with Charlemagne on The Breakfast Club a day earlier. Donald Trump, of course, looking at this massive gender gap and held a town hall with all female voters yesterday on Fox. Where's your head on this, Adam? I mean, do we really believe that there's this big pocket of undecided voters out there? Or are we just nibbling around the edges with less than 3 weeks to go?
I think for the most part, we're nibbling around the edges. I think there is no question the campaigns feel they have to do whatever they can to drive up the margins wherever they can. And so, whether it's crisscrossing the state of Wisconsin, trying to find any voters in pockets, ironically, it's in areas that Barack Obama performed particularly well with in both of his campaigns in 2008 and 2012, that Hillary Clinton didn't do quite as well in 2016. And so you see the Harris campaign really trying to go to different areas of the country, different areas of these swing states beyond just the big cities, to try to both drive up her margins, but also to hold down Donald Trump's margins in some of these swing counties, some of these redder counties. And so appearing with former Trump administration officials makes a lot of sense. You could think about the Fox News interview as also trying to appeal to those Nikki Haley voters, right? The folks who, despite the fact that she was out of the race, still came out to vote for her in the primary. I think the campaign feels like there's a way to broaden the coalition to get more people on board. And that may be the ultimate thing that tips the balance on Election Day.
I get the effort. I just wonder if these interviews or media appearances actually move a voter. You sit down and watch a 45-minute interview or a 20-minute interview. Does that actually change the way you feel about someone, or does it simply acknowledge or even amplify existing feelings? Republicans thought Brett Baer won last night. Democrats thought Kamala Harris owned Fox News. Does it change anything?
I think the Fox News interview actually is interesting because I think there are, again, that segment of Nikki Haley type voters who aren't sure they don't think they want to vote for Donald Trump, but they're not quite convinced they want to vote for her. They're not watching MSNBC or, no offense, Bloomberg TV on a daily basis, right? Like they're tuned into Fox News. And so they should turn on Bloomberg and watch it, especially during, when you're on. But I think that where they really need to try to focus is grow that base, try to expand that coalition. And so that's where the focus is. Remember, we're not going to get another debate. So if they can find another audience, find bigger audiences where they can reach more voters, that is important as we get into this home stretch of the campaign.
I wonder if Joe Rogan is next. Apparently, Kamala Harris says she's going to do it. Donald Trump, you never know, could show up. Joe Rogan seems to be pretty friendly to Donald Trump. Is she ready for a conversation like that? That the the stakes get higher along with some of these different interviews here. This is not Brett Baer sitting down on Fox News. Joe Rogan can kind of do whatever he wants, right?
But look, if you want to be commander in chief, you want to be president of the United States, like you got to be able to take the heat. So yeah, I think Kamala Harris has certainly tried and showed over the last few weeks that she's willing to take and talk to whoever she can and try to broaden the coalition. I think it's smart, and I think you'll see more of those conversations throughout the campaign. And I also look back, to the interview with Charlemagne the God. That was not necessarily a friendly kind of like layup interview. I mean, they probed and asked some tough questions. Callers called in and asked some tough questions. There's also no substitute for taking questions from the voters directly. And that was what jumped out to me from Trump's town hall, the Univision town hall. I mean, the one that's rocketing around sort of the afters, his question about January 6th, really telling somebody, if you don't want to vote for me, don't vote for me. That really rubs people the wrong way.
It's an interesting appeal. I do wonder what Kamala Harris will do when Joe Rogan lights the joint during that interview, but we can come back around when that happens. I've got to ask you, Adam, about what's coming out of Israel today and whether there's an impact on the campaign. It does seem that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and right now the IDF says it has killed the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, in an operation in Gaza. Every headline like this, Adam, reminds people of the administration's stand on this, knowing that Joe Biden ran into some trouble with progressive Democrats and still feels that pushback on his Israel policy. You were a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council. In our remaining moment here, Adam, how important is this development?
Well, look, there's no question that Sinwar was a terrorist, and if he's got blood on his hands and was the mastermind behind October 7th. But so it's no surprise Israel was very clear from the very beginning that his days were numbered as far as they were concerned, and they were going to do what they could to take him out. I think there is a broader question going forward about how Israel continues to defend itself, and especially watching all the events on the northern border. The White House clearly is trying to keep a lid on the Middle East and prevent a wider regional war. I think it's holding on by threads at the moment, but if they can get that, we're all better served by avoiding broader escalation in the region. And so the right to focus on trying to help prevent that wider regional war. And I think that's something that voters don't necessarily put foreign policy top of the list, but Kamala Harris has to hope that it remains as quiet as possible.
There could be a lot more where this came from. Adam, I'm glad you could join us today. Appreciate it very much. From Bully Pulpit International, where he's managing director, that's Adam Hodge. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.